Hello everybody, I'm John Schneider, and these are images from the 1960s when I was going to high school and every kid was Caucasian. This is a special episode of Jersey Bayshore Country, not so much about all the great things to do and see here, but about our area's darker history regarding slavery and segregation. And unfortunately, it's a history we share with the rest of the country.
Hello, I'm Graham Hodges. I'm the Langdon Professor of History at Colgate University. I'm the author of 8 books, and one of my books is on Monmouth County during the early American Republic. New Jersey starts off as a colony with slaves, and this spot, Tinton Falls, is an early attempt to industrialize slavery in the north. Lewis Morris, who was one of the leading merchants and landowners in early Jersey, established an iron mine and refinery, and there Lewis Morris employed up to 40 enslaved people over the next 25 or 30 years. What Morris was doing here was pretty revolutionary because it wasn't agricultural. It was to create a product and to use enslaved labor to do just that. Historians like to think about societies with slaves and slave societies. The first is a society where slavery is one of a number of systems, not necessarily the most important. Slave societies, on the other hand, most famously the Sugar Islands, the West Indies, or the rice plantations of South Carolina, or the cotton fields, where slavery is the primary engine of the economy. Now, New Jersey has both. There are towns in which there are a few slaves, but there are also towns, like Freehold in particular, where there are far, far more enslaved people than there were available landless young white males for employment. Okay. So it's a place where slavery in the fullest sense exists. It is the economic engine that propels the fortunes of small Dutch, Huguenot, Scot-Irish farmers. Those people find it very necessary to own a slave to clear the land, to make an arable property, and then year-round work at growing crops, at harvesting them, doing all kinds of labor throughout the year. So slavery is critical to the economic well-being of New Jersey from its founding in the 1660s almost till the time of the Civil War. New Jersey, like most of North America, was not a principal stopping point for the African slave trade. Most of it went to Brazil. The rest went to the West Indies. And what was left over would come up to, what people were left over would come up to the Carolinas and then further north. Okay, so this is not a main focus of the international slave trade. So there would be occasional direct voyages, but overall most enslaved people came in single lots or on consignment from the West Indies or further south, and would be purchased at the dock. Everyone in early America believes in God. It's impossible to be an atheist. If one believes in God, especially if one is a member of the Church of England, there's an obligation to proselytize, to ensure that all the people who are around you are also believers. To have people who are unbelievers is to risk their damnation and possibly your own. So people like Lewis Morris absolutely saw it as critical to their existence that their enslaved people be Christianized in some way. Ultimately, self-interest, the need to justify one's ownership of another human being, makes those pietist slave owners doubt the possibility for Africans to be saved. If in fact they have no more knowledge of the Holy Spirit than a horse, well then why bother? Throughout this period, baptism mandates emancipation. Even though there are laws which state that baptism does not disturb one's civil condition, that's not a law that's oftentimes respected. Okay? So there's a contradiction there. Why would you send this valuable property down to the Anglican Church where he or she might learn ideas that would require their freedom? Okay? better for your own self-interest, for your own justification, to see them as no more worthy of Christianity than a horse. Enslaved people had to be subdued. They wanted their freedom. They're oftentimes very confused about why they were there. Okay? So the brutal subordination of another human being is something that has to happen constantly. And so in the case of women, brothers would come in, fathers would come in. There was a sense that guarding against the enemy within was critically important, and that all white men had to help out in this constant battle. Slaves ran away. They ran away to the mines. They ran away to vessels. They ran away to Native American territory. They ran away to other towns. Once captured, they'd be beaten. If they ran away again, they'd be beaten a second time, and so on. That kind of physical subordination is absolutely necessary. So, for a long time, there was a myth that in some ways northern slavery was milder than southern slavery. That is not true at all. Slaves were property. And if a slave master murdered his slave, it would be usually excusable. Only in very egregious instances would there be any prosecution. It would be very unusual if that had happened. Basically, it's simply the right to control one's property as you see fit. Okay? And it's also a society where physical violence was common. Okay? So whether it be actually straight out legal is not really not the question. Whether it be prosecutions, that would be very unlikely. Quakers from the 1730s, 1740s were openly against slavery. They weren't interested in black equality, but slavery they felt was wrong for the human soul. Now, African Americans, of course, would escape. They wouldn't be able to voice their own opinions, although sometimes they did. There was an incident in Raritan in the 1730s in which a drunken slave told a white person that the whites were holding the blacks bondage in contrary to King George's wishes, and that soon the situation would be turned. Okay? So you find this a lot. There would be enslaved people who would be very insolent, especially if they had a little bit of drink in them, okay? And they would express their deep anger at being owned. Okay? Others were more silent and simply took off. Pre-revolutionary turmoil begins in the 1760s. There is a restiveness, a movement among enslaved people. They hear all of these same things. They hear their white masters and their friends talking about what's to be done. Okay? They hear about other enslaved people running away. The grapevine is unquestionably a way by which information gets out about the British invitations to come to New York City and fight for them and gain freedom, about which churches are more likely to baptize and then possibly open up the road to emancipation. People did know about events and they knew about possibilities. And being enslaved people and wanting freedom, they paid very close attention. There was clearly a restiveness happening among African Americans when the Continental Army is formed in 1775. Okay. Now, New Jersey is famously known as the cockpit of the Revolution. And from Washington's retreat into Fort Lee in the fall of 1776 until the end of the American Revolution, New Jersey has almost incessant fighting. Armies march back and forth across New Jersey periodically. So you'll find the same family declaring loyalism or patriotism according to who's going through. It really makes a big difficulty for slave masters in New Jersey. Their economy is already beset by war. But now one of the most important properties they have is taking off and going and living among the British in New York City, and oftentimes serving them either as the servants of officers, as orderlies, okay, but also as fighters. One of the most famous is Colonel Ty. Colonel Ty's story in some ways epitomizes all of this tumult that will be happening within the minds and souls of African Americans. Colonel Ty was originally known as Titus Corliss, and he is the enslaved person of a guy named John Corliss. Titus takes off. Titus becomes quite well known in the summer and fall of 1779 and also the following year, when he's stationed out in Sandy Hook. He is now Colonel Ty, leader of a motley band of black and white refugees who raid the area of Shrewsbury, Middletown, Freehold, Sinton Falls, raid the homes of patriots. Barnes Smock, who was a captain of militia, has his home, his cannon spiked. Okay? But go into people's houses, take whatever is valuable, take their cattle, take their forage, goes over to Sandy Hook, the British come and pick it up, pay them money for this, and this happens over and over again. So David Foreman, who is a leaving patriot, writes anxiously to Governor Livingston and says, you've got to help us out. You got to declare martial law here because this Colonel Ty is wreaking havoc. He does this over and over again. Okay? And so he is emblematic of the military participation of blacks in the English Army. Josiah Huddy was very famous in New Jersey for his treatment of loyalists. He was a very belligerent guy and was responsible for several killings. Colonel Ty and his band capture Josiah Huddy at his home in Toms River in the fall of 1780, and then as they are taking him across the bay, Navesink Bay, a group of patriots attacks them, and there's a constant battle. And during this time, Huddy escapes by swimming away. Colonel Ty is wounded in the wrist and, lacking any kind of medical treatment, develops lockjaw and dies within a couple of weeks. So by the 1780s, Colonel Ty is dead, but his memory lives on. You'll find him in the histories of Monmouth County written in the 1830s and 1840s. And they talk about him with some admiration and even say that had he been on the Patriot side, the war might have ended earlier. Because they thought he was really a very brave, skillful tactician. So Colonel Ty is certainly initially part of the revolutionary memory of New Jersey. By 1783, there were about 60,000 people living in New York City. About a tenth of them were formerly enslaved people who had self-emancipated themselves, gone to the British. Okay. As the British began to evacuate New York in 1782, formerly enslaved people would go with them. Okay. This was not at all clear until the famous negotiations between Sir Guy Carleton, who was the commander-in-chief of British forces in North America, and George Washington, who needs no introduction. And they met in Newburgh in 1783. Washington asked about the 7th article, that all property would be returned. And specifically, it asked about slaves. Carleton said, they're gone. Gone, you say, said Washington. He'd lost about 12 or 15 people. So he was concerned about this. Okay? And Carleton answered that yes, that the king had an obligation to these people. And in fact, if you think about it, the generals had made proclamations offering freedom. Okay, to go back on that would besmirch the honor of the king. But there was a powerful sense that blacks had fought for the English, so why should we give them their freedom? The same feeling was about Quakers, that they at least had stood by during the Revolution, and Quakers were key allies in the black demands for freedom. But there was no particular impetus in New Jersey to move towards gradual emancipation. Now, mind you, Pennsylvania had declared gradual emancipation in 1780. Massachusetts the same year. Vermont, which is a breakaway territory from New York, had established it in 1777. Connecticut does in 1784. There's a powerful move in the North to gradually emancipate slavery. It was slavery, at least for the 30 years or so after the Revolution, was an open question. Whether it would survive, how much it conflicted with the ideals of the American Revolution, that all people were created equal, I mean, obviously it does. How to rationalize that? It took a number of decades in the growth of racism, and the view of pro-slavery is a positive force. But that doesn't happen until the 1840s. So for a long time, whether it's in black newspapers or white abolitionist newspapers supported by blacks, or even just in the regular journals, discussions of the positive and negative natures of slavery were fairly common. New Jersey moves very haltingly towards gradual emancipation. Once it does so, in distinction from New York, which enacts a law in 1817 that will end slavery permanently in 1827, New Jersey does not. New Jersey, slave masters, are not terribly interested in ending human bondage. Even as late as 1846, when there are a number of enslaved people in Monmouth, more so though in Bergen perhaps, and in Somerset, a law is, the state assembly passes a law which makes slaves into lifetime indentured servants. But in my own research, I found fugitive slave notices in Monmouth newspapers as late as 1857. Gradually, Monmouth abolishes slavery, but it takes decades and decades. And during that time, masters squeezed every ounce they could out of their ownership. And once that was finished, felt absolutely no compunction about exploiting their former slaves. One of the systems that was used in New Jersey very commonly was for the master to offer the former slave a cottage on his property, to feed him, to give him tools, give him firewood, and that would be taken out of the annual earnings. It was sharecropping under a different name. And so one finds in the census, and I detail this in my book on slavery and freedom in the rural North, that blacks are oftentimes, even though they're free, highly dependent upon masters for decades to come. Or for that matter, it could be a family with the mother and father are free and the son and the daughter who were enslaved. Or a husband who was enslaved and a wife who was free. These kind of complex family situations are very common. Slaves remain, black people remain important agricultural laborers. They were important for the mills, important for the mines. They were widely used as domestics. So they are a critical part of the economy. And they would not be paid the wages to which they were deserved, nor were they treated with any kind of equality. What one does see is the rise of kind of a modern racism during this time, much more so than the colonial period, in which there are pseudo-biological beliefs about the inferiority of one group. One does not find, I think it's very, very interesting, that African Americans generally joined the denomination of their masters. It's true, especially for the Reformed Church. Very, very few blacks were members. Rather, what they would do, beginning with itinerant ministers such as John Jay and George White, working out of New York, they would ride through the countryside preaching the gospel. And be listened to in the fields, in homes, wherever people would gather. From that develops the AME Zion Church, which is very important, and the establishment of small rural churches for black people. And with that, the creation of a kind of society, people who are can worship together and find a commonality. One does also find the growth of a tiny middle class, people who own a few hundred acres, who begin to own more possessions, furniture, mirrors, Bibles. You can see this in their wills. You can see it in the tax forms that they had to fill out. They're not a lot. It's thin, but there are people who are learning to live in Monmouth County rather than, as most people, black people did, to flee to the big cities and try to get a better life there. But gradually Monmouth County does develop a kind of middle class by the 1840s and 1850s. While slavery may have gone through a slow death in the early 19th century. That New Jersey's economy, as with New York's, as with New England's, was still very heavily dependent on slavery. Right? That the ownership of slaves was the most important property of any kind in the United States in 1860. Any kind. Not furniture, not land, not stock securities, people. Right? We now understand that everything was tied together in those days. Okay? So I think that's something that people are only now beginning to grasp about our past, that slavery was not only there, but it was critical to the economic and social development of the nation. But once Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, and then invited blacks to serve in the Union Army, they did so, of course, we know now, by the hundreds of thousands, and are the principal reason why the Union Army eventually won by wearing down the South. And Monmouth County blacks served. Okay, there are rough totals. We know about some of them. Probably several hundred eventually went and served. And they did so because they knew they were ending slavery. It was not just that this was something that would earn them a meal, because by then it was pretty obvious it was a very dangerous war. One could get easily killed. But rather because they firmly believed that this is a war to end slavery. Booker T. Washington is important for our story about Monmouth County in New Jersey because his ideology of self-uplift, of dignity, and acceptance of separation becomes a predominant mode among black New Jerseyans in the 1870s and 1890s. Okay? In fact, some ways it anticipates what he does, because the post-Civil War period was a time of Reconstruction followed by terror, by lynchings, by murders, by intimidation, by growing segregation. And so someone like Booker T. Washington his philosophy was a means of trying to deal with a nearly impossible situation. Or as Rayford Logan, the great black historian, called it, the nadir of race relations. No matter how bad we think things are today, they were worse then. The long shadow of slavery continues into the 20th and 21st century. There's no doubt about that. Slavery and the desire by former masters to control black people in bondage is a reason for Jim Crow. It's a rise for the mass prison system, a reason for racism, justification for it. So slavery may not be, as it was in the 1850s, the bulwark of the American economy. And that's true north as well as south. That may no longer be the case, but the after effects are very much there.
I'm Edward L. Jones, born and raised in Navy, New Jersey, Latham Avenue. Went to school, Milltown School, graduated in 1945, put a year and a half in the service, came back out, and went to work for the railroad, worked 30 years for the railroad, right? 30 years for a funeral parlor in Red Bank Child Funeral Home. I think I'm the oldest living person in Navy right about now, and that's the truth. I don't think there's anybody in Navy my age. Segregation was a dog, right? I was in Alabama in uniform, and I went to the place to get my picture taken. And the guy started calling me right out of my name first thing. Called me nigger right off the bat. Told me how people down there didn't like niggas and how he did, and then if I was in town, I never even do, I could come up and talk to him, right? I was 19 years old and scared to death, petrified, right? Because you never knew what they were going to do to you. It was tough. And even when you talk about segregation, it wasn't only in the South, it was here too. It was tougher in this time. And I can remember going to Atlantic Highlands Theater, you had to sit on this side, designated spots. Same thing in Red Bank in the Carlton, you had to sit upstairs. But I learned to live with it. I learned to cope with it. I have a whole lot of white friends. And I had guys would fight for me, guys would fight with me. Then you had guys who would fight you, right? Because they didn't want you in their spot. It's still here too. People think it's all gone, but it's not. It's still there.
How did you, as a young man, did your family give you any guidance on it? How did you, what went through your mind about how could you be treated that way? It just seems unconscious.
Well, you knew knew you had to cope with it, and you learned to cope with it. That's the way you would learn. You knew what it was there, and you learned to cope with it.
But I would feel beaten down. I would feel.
Well, we did.
Did you?
And we still do, because you still get it, right?
Why do you think that is?
I don't know. Do tell me why white people think they're superior because their skin is lighter. You tell me that.
Or
And
you're just
that's where it is. I was in Alabama, right? I'll tell you this in the service. You go down the street, and you see a white person might pass his house. They be sitting with their feet up on the banister, right? Bottom of the socks, black as they want, and they'd call you out of your name. Right? Why? You're not bothering them, but they'd call you out of your name. They thought they were superior. I can remember being in Alabama, and Joe Louis was fighting Billy Conn, prize fight, and we couldn't go off the post. Not the black soldiers, they wouldn't let us go off. I remember, right? Got drafted, right? Not I didn't go in the army because I wanted. I went in there because they made me go in there. Went from Fort Dix to Alabama, right? In a troop train, mixed up. Right? Black and white in the same train. Got to Alabama when they unloaded. They said, we weren't blacks back then, we were colored. They said, all the white soldiers over here, all the colored soldiers over there. All black outfit. Right? The only thing white in my outfit was my commanding officer. They marched the white soldiers to that side of the camp, and us to that side. And we never saw the guys that we left Jersey with. Right? They went one way, we went another. Everything in my outfit was black except for the company commander. And that's where it was until I got out of service. And I got out of service in 47.
You said it still exists. I believe
and it does. It does. People don't think it does, but you know, you go a lot of places they don't want you in there. They wouldn't tell you they don't want you in there, but you can tell by their actions that you're not wanted.